In this video, we discuss the concept of moral responsibility. Getting clear on moral responsibility is essential for developing our own approach to business ethics and for understanding how to approach moral issues as they confront businesses in the modern world. The first thing we're going to do then is talk about elements of moral responsibility. Anytime a person or individual has moral responsibility, there are three criteria that must be met. We move on then to talk about mitigating factors. These are conditions of a situation that make someone's moral responsibility somewhat less. And finally, we'll apply these concepts through a brief introduction of the case studies for this week. We sometimes have a tendency to blame one person or one party for some unsavory event that has occurred. In reality, most of the time, moral responsibility will be shared among a number of individuals or groups. This is because the elements of moral responsibility that we'll discuss on the next slide are the sorts of things that apply not to just one person or party, but they will be experienced by a number of people, a number of parties at the same time. The other thing to remember about moral responsibility is that it comes in degrees, which means that I can be fully responsible for something, or more often, partly responsible, or perhaps not very responsible at all. In order for us to think intelligently about ethics in any context, and especially in the business context, we should remember to talk in terms of degrees and not absolutes of moral responsibility. According to Velasquez, there are three elements of moral responsibility, the first being causality. It must be the case, in order for me to be morally responsible, that I had some sort of causal connection to the event, or at least the event must be the kind of thing that I could have prevented, but failed to do so. Secondly, of course, I must have knowledge. In particular, I must know about the situation, I must know what the moral ramifications are, and I must have this knowledge available to me at the time that the event is occurring. And finally, I need freedom. It must be the case that I freely acted in this situation. So if I have a causal connection, if I have knowledge of the event and what is at stake, and I freely take the action, then I have moral responsibility. However, I could be in a situation in which I have causality, knowledge, and freedom, and yet my moral responsibility might be reduced somewhat. Velasquez discusses a number of mitigating factors in the text. What is a mitigating factor? A mitigating factor is a situation that can lessen a person's responsibility for an event, depending on the severity of the wrong. So there could be some feature of the situation that doesn't totally take away someone's moral responsibility, but does lessen it to a degree. And Velasquez introduces us to four mitigating factors. The first is a minimal contribution. So while I might have a causal connection to the event, if my contribution is small, my moral responsibility is mitigated. In other words, my moral responsibility is correspondingly small. The event might not be something that's in my area of responsibility. So this is another way in which I could have a minimal contribution to the event. Now this is quite controversial, actually. One question that's often discussed among ethicists and in public policy spheres is whether a person who passively allows something to happen is as responsible as the person who actually does the thing. Some people are convinced that passively allowing something to happen based on the idea that it's not in your area of responsibility makes one just as culpable as someone who actually did the offending thing. This is something we'll have an occasion to talk about later in the course. The second mitigating factor has to do about uncertainty. Remember that the second element of moral responsibility is knowledge. But what if I'm uncertain, for instance, about the facts of the case? Perhaps I'm not sure exactly what's happening. Or maybe it's not clear to me what my moral obligation actually is. There's a lack of clarity, there's vagueness or grayness in the moral principles that are at stake, and I don't have a clear grasp of them. Finally, I might have a basic idea of the facts of the case, but not understand how serious a matter it is. If any of these things occur, then this is a kind of uncertainty that would lessen my moral responsibility to a degree. Is the difficulty of acting. Sometimes we know the right thing to be done, but it's very difficult for us to do it. For instance, there could be onerous personal costs. It might be the case that I could lose my job, or that my family members might be threatened, or that I might be threatened if I were to do the right thing. To the degree to which it is very difficult personally for me to act correctly, this mitigates my responsibility to a degree. The fourth mitigating factor has to do with the severity of the wrong. The more serious the wrong, the less one's responsibility is mitigated by the above factors. So if the severity of the wrong is very great, for instance, if I'm involved in being a guard at a prison camp during the Holocaust, I might say, well, this wasn't my responsibility, or I was doing what I was ordered. But the wrong being committed in those prison camps is so horrific and evil that it is not legitimate for me to claim these mitigating factors as having significantly reduced my moral responsibility. Finally, one's responsibility is not mitigated by the fact that one was just following orders. If something is evil enough, if it's terrible enough, and if we have the knowledge that this is something wrong, then it's not an excuse that we were following orders. Also, it's not an excuse that others were involved in causing the wrong. Again, responsibility comes in degrees, and the degree to which we were responsible for the event, or that we had causal influence on the event, is the degree to which we will have moral blame. The concepts of moral responsibility and mitigation are especially applicable to the case studies that we'll look at this week. With regards to Merck and river blindness, we want to ask the question, is Merck morally responsible for creating a cure for river blindness? Certainly they didn't create the disease. Do they have an obligation to cure it? Looking at the criteria for moral responsibility and mitigation should shed important light on this question. We also are going to take a look at slavery in the chocolate industry. And I think when you look carefully at that case study, you'll see that there are a number of parties that actually contribute to the slavery of children in the Ivory Coast. Which ones are most morally responsible? Which ones are least morally responsible? We want to go beyond just condemning everyone involved in the process to look at degrees of responsibility and not just responsibility. Finally, fraud at Health South. This was a complicated situation of fraud at Health South, and it's particularly interesting to look at all of the parties in this case and to determine to what degree they're morally responsible and to what degree some of their responsibility might be mitigated by the factors we've looked at today.